Hello and welcome to iGCSE Success. And if you're new here, a big hello to you. I'm an English teacher and I post content here on YouTube to prepare students for their Cambridge First Language English exam. And if that's what you're looking for, be sure to check out my other videos in my channel because I break down a number of the core skills needed to succeed with First Language English. Now in today's video, I will be looking at the writer's effect question from the May-June 2019 series. Now I've looked at the last Zookeeper paper already, well, the writer's effect question, and I will link that up here. However, the paper we will be looking at today is titled Thirst, or at least the fiction piece is titled Thirst. Should you wish to have a go at any of the questions from this particular paper, I will be sure to link all of the relevant materials in the description box below. And as a side note, the paper that we'll be looking at today, titled Thirst, it is one of my favourite papers, particularly when looking at the skills needed for the writer's effect question. Now, I'm not going to be reading the full paper, I'm just going to be reading the 2 paragraphs which we are directed to. However, again, if you do want to read the whole insert, I will link that in the description box below. I'll read out the 2 paragraphs, we'll discuss them, annotate, analyse, all of that good stuff, and I will end with looking at 2 model paragraphs for the writer's effect question. So without further ado, let's start today's video. Okay, so what you are looking at now is the first paragraph you are directed to for the writer's effect question. Remember, this question comes from the 2019 May-June series. And again, I will leave a link with all relevant materials should you wish to attempt this question or any question on the paper for that matter. Just to give you a bit of context, however, the text centres around a drought and the impact this has on the city and the wider community. And we also have the misfortune of meeting a rather greedy and selfish person who wants to keep all the water for himself. So let's begin by reading the paragraph. Note I have already chosen my 3 powerful images just to speed things up a little. So the first paragraph reads, "Days later, Marchand and I decided that we should pool our reserve petrol and take my motorbike inland to the city. From the road descending the hills, everything still looked normal. Donkeys pulling their wagons, bicycles, admittedly fewer cars than before. It was only as we came closer that we noticed differences. The city was quieter than usual, torpid as if its unlubricated gears and belts had seized up. People seemed to be crumbling, turning to dust and salt, a ghostly, powdery rabble. A strong wind could scatter them into clouds of dead skin. Desiccated, dehydrated adults were too tired to toil or trade. Children too sluggish to learn." Okay, so if you have watched any of my other videos on the writer's effect question, you'll know the first step is understanding what the writer is trying to achieve through their language. And this first step will ultimately allow us to write a really focused and concise sentence for the opening to our first writer's effect paragraph. Now, hopefully you can see that as a result of the drought, the city is certainly struggling. It doesn't seem to be operating the way it once did, and the people living in the city are also struggling. Their health seems to be deteriorating in quite an alarming way. Now let's move on to looking specifically at the quotes I have highlighted. Remember, you really want to pick 3 powerful images that will allow you to say something pertinent about the writer's use of language. You don't want to be clutching at straws, so pick the 3 images you feel confident in terms of exploring what the writer is trying to achieve. Now, our first image, which I've highlighted in green, of the unlubricated gears and that the belts of the city have seized up. Hopefully from this image you can see a parallel here between the current state of the city and how it's running and an almost defunct engine of sorts, which is also not working. Now, of course, the city has seized up because there's no one to run it. Everyone is struggling and desperately needs water. Now, our second image, highlighted in yellow, is particularly powerful, with the writer likening some of the people to a ghostly and powdery rabble. Really think of the connotations to these words, guys. It's almost as if the people of the city are close to death. Now, moving on to our last image, highlighting in blue, where the writer describes the adults being both desiccated and dehydrated, is also incredibly powerful. The alliteration of the D, of course, reinforcing how bleak and miserable their situation is, and how they are almost drying up and they are in desperate need of even the slightest bit of moisture. So now let's look at a model paragraph. But before I do that, let's remind ourselves of the 5 steps you should be taking to ensure you have a well-organized response. So hopefully, guys, you can see an infographic on your screens now, and these are the 5 steps you want to be following. Okay, so let's just quickly go through them. So step 1, of course, is identifying what the writer is trying to achieve. So you should start each paragraph with the following sentence starter: the overall effect of the language. And I would also advise you to follow that with create an image of. Step 2 is to use a suitable transition phrase. I recommend the following: the writer begins by. Step 3 is using your first quotation and trying to keep that quotation nice and short so you are easily able to embed that into your sentence. Step 4 is what I like to call the zoom in technique. So zooming into a particular technique the writer has used, or zooming into a powerful word or phrase. And quite simply, you can use the sentence starter, the writer's use of the. And the last step is to use a suitable analytical verb or phrase. This suggests, this highlights, this creates an image of, this emphasizes, etc. And if I can just draw your attention to the notes, the bottom right hand side, once you have followed all steps, all you need to do is simply repeat steps 2 to 5 for your second and third quotation. So let's take a look at a model paragraph which uses those 5 steps. The overall effect of the language creates an image of how the city is struggling and how the people have been massively affected by the drought. The city is at a standstill and the people seem to be void of life and any vigor. So what we have here, guys, is the first step where we look at what the writer is trying to achieve. And I'm just going to highlight that as step 1. Now, step 2, of course, is using a transition phrase, and I just recommend simply using the writer begins by describing, and I'm just going to highlight that. The writer begins by describing the city as though its unlubricated gears and belts had seized up. Now, we've got our first quotation here, and again, I'm just going to highlight that as step 3. The writer's use of imagery here is particularly striking as it likens the city to an engine that is no longer properly functioning as a result of people not having the energy to ensure things are running as normal. Now, of course, the writer's use of imagery here is the zoom in technique, so I'm just going to highlight that as well. So that's step 4, and then everything else that follows is step 5. So that's where you infer, that's where you analyze. So I'm just going to highlight that with a different color. Hopefully you can see that okay. I'll just change the font. There we go. Okay, so let's finish reading this. So the writer then goes on to describe some of the people as being a ghostly, powdery rabble to highlight the palpable struggles people are facing. The writer's use of the adjective ghostly creates a powerful image of how the drought has impacted the health of many people living in the city. It's almost as if they are close to death. Furthermore, there's a sense of them being a disorderly group, desperately searching for the same thing: water. Lastly, the writer draws our focus to an image of desiccated and dehydrated adults. The writer's use of imagery here, coupled with the alliterative plosive D sound, is incredibly powerful as it creates a bleak image of how the adults are almost dried up. They have no vitality or energy left and are in desperate need of water. It's clear to see that they are shadows of their former selves. Now, of course, I won't highlight the whole thing, but of course, the writer then goes on to describe that is your transition phrase, and then you've got your quotation. I'll highlight that in blue. And then you've got your zoom in technique, the writer's use of the adjective. So I'll just put that in purple. And all you really need to do, guys, is just ensure you follow those 5 steps for each of the quotations. Okay, so now let's take a look at the second paragraph we are directed to. And the next paragraph reads, "We heard him fumbling theatrically with the catch and prized open the door, shoving our Jaffa aside. The cavernous cellar was stocked ceiling high with precious casks of water. Merchant took the axe head to one cask, releasing a translucent torrent of crystal clear water that we attached ourselves to, lip first, like ticks to a sheep. Our Jaffa had enough water to keep us for weeks, and here he was hoarding." And just to give you a bit more context here, guys, despite how many have been suffering, Al Jaffa has decided to hoard a large amount of water. He's not a fan of sharing, clearly, and towards the end his hoard is finally discovered. With that information, hopefully you can see that the writer is trying to convey 2 things: Al Jaffa's greed, as well as how precious the water is to the others when they discover it. Now let's take a look at the first image I have highlighted of Al Jaffa fumbling theatrically. It's clear that, or hopefully it's clear that he's trying to make everyone suffer just for a little bit longer. He knows he has been rumbled, that he's been found out. Now let's take a look at the second image I have highlighted in yellow, and that is of Al Jaffa's cellar being described as cavernous. Hopefully this allows you to see his greed further. He's carefully, or the implication is that he's carefully thought about this, and his cellar is stacked to the brim with water. I mean, how terrible is that, guys? And the last image which I have highlighted in blue is when Marchand takes an axe to one of the casks and releases a torrent of water. And of course this emphasizes the beauty of the water and how precious the water is to those who find it. Now let's take a look at our second model paragraph. Again, I'll be using the 5 steps. I'm not going to highlight this time because I want to speed this video up as much as possible. Let's take a look at the model. So, the overall effect of the language creates an image of how precious the water is, as well as highlighting Al Jaffa's greed and his relentless pursuit to try and keep the water to himself. The writer begins by describing Al Jaffa as fumbling theatrically to try and prevent the others from finding his hoard of water. The writer's use of imagery here, particularly with the use of the adverb theatrically, creates a ridiculous image of Al-Jafar trying to make everyone suffer for even longer by pretending to struggle with the lock. The fact that he continues to extend the suffering of those who desperately need water emphasizes his villainous qualities. It's clear that he cares very little for those who have been struggling for a long time. The writer then goes on to describe Al-Jafar's cavernous cellar and the abundance of water he has been hiding. The writer's use of the adjective cavernous is particularly powerful as it serves to emphasize Al-Jafar's greed further. The fact that the writer focuses on the sheer size of the room helps us to visualize how much water he has been selfishly hoarding. It almost seems to be overwhelming for those who have discovered it. Lastly, the writer goes on to describe Marchand taking an axe to one of the casks and subsequently releasing a translucent torrent of crystal clear water. The writer's use of imagery here highlights the force in which the water comes gushing out of the cask. It also creates an image of the beauty of the water and how precious it is to those who have been having to go without. And that's all from me today, guys. Again, I hope this video has been useful. Please do keep your comments, questions coming. I really appreciate them and I do respond to every comment that I receive. Your support is really helping me grow this channel. We are almost at 500 subscribers. I mean, that is crazy. So don't forget to like and subscribe and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.